Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to be talking about the ins and outs of insider threats. And I have with me here today Dr. Randy Garrett. He's our chief data scientist here at Change Dynamics. And Dr. Garrett has some extensive experience with big data analytics and cybersecurity. And he was actually honored with an outstanding civilian service medal from the U.S. Secretary of Defense for his management work at DARPA. And he's held many senior management positions at SAIC, General Dynamics, and Rockwell. And we're excited to have him join Change Dynamics and to do this webinar series with us. I'm Kim Singletary. I'm the head of marketing here at Change Dynamics, and we're going to get started. So we're going to talk about today the ins and outs of insider threats.
Thanks for that introduction, Kim. I wish my mother could have heard that. As you said, today we're going to talk about insider threats. So to begin with, we'll discuss what is an insider threat, what do we mean when we say that, why should you care about them, why are they important, how do you go about detecting them, and basically what are the current methods of detection, and what do we think is the future. So essentially, an insider threat is someone that you've given access to your system. So as opposed to an outsider who has to break in, you've given them the keys. It's part of their job. It's part of their business. So we typically think of an employee, but it could also be a vendor or some other contractor that you work with. So the problem is that they're inside your system. They work on your network every day as part of their job. They have all the credentials. They have thorough knowledge of your system. So they're obviously a potential major threat. Within the government, we call these insider threats are called spies. There's a whole security organization set up to look out for spies, capture them. There are federal laws in place. It's a felony to be a spy in the federal government, so the threat is definitely taken seriously there. These same kinds of threats can be just as dangerous to your business, but most businesses don't have the infrastructure set up to deal with them that the government has put in place. So that's what we're going to look at today.
So Randy, we've been looking at this for a while, and kind of I kind of classify three different categories of insider threats. And I think most people are when they see insider threats, they're really thinking about their intent is malicious. They may be departing employees, disgruntled employees, rogue users. I think that's where the definition kind of started out with. But you just kind of expanded that definition, to talk about those that you've authorized, but that are inside your network, but that can also be accounts that have been compromised, and also just people doing things that they should not be doing from an anomalous behavior. There's not an intent behind that. They just, maybe mistakenly put all your financial records out on the cloud or something like that. So, do you think this is the right approach for the definition going forward?
Yes, there does seem to be a big trend to expand on the definition to include these other areas that you talked about. And one that I think is particularly important that you've mentioned briefly under the anomalous behavior is the API and database connection abuse, and then in particular the operational technology and the behavioral anomalies there for the Internet of Things. So in monitoring security threats, I've seen a rapid rise in the use of those connected devices as launch points for attacks. So I think we don't pay much attention to them because they're small, generally small and low cost. But if you think about webcams and security cameras, those are actually a computer, a small one, but a computer. They're connected to your network. Frequently they have like no security. but at most they have a little bit of security. So they're easy victims for an outsider to take over. And again, very few people are monitoring them. So anyway, in conclusion, the threat has definitely expanded to now not only include employees, but even devices that are inside your network.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. It kind of talks about, we're seeing this as a growing significance out there. And it's not just a, insider threat. Again, the traditional definition is people, right? It's a person who has malintent against your organization. But we're actually seeing this insider threat go across the people, process, and technology, especially as so many businesses are relying on digital things like Internet of Things, but also they're just doing business faster because of digital and putting data out there and creating data and bringing data at the speed of your customers, the way they want it, the way they need it. So I think we've always kind of dealt with people, right? Users are anywhere. Knowledge workers tend to work 24/7 sometimes. But the stats here say that most organizations, like the leaders of those organizations, do feel very vulnerable to insider threats. 74%. That's a high number. But the thing that really scares me here is the process, right? Data is everywhere, but 88% of those people that were polled here do not have any sort of formal or ongoing data classification practice. And I kind of look at that as, how can you protect your data if you don't know what data is more valuable than others? I mean, of course, we have the PCI compliance and HIPAA and those things where we have the industries dictating what is important. But for inside businesses, intellectual property is definitely something that, a formal classification practice would help them to help protect that better. I think we're past the days where everything is important all the same. And very much like the government, which I think you could talk to, Randy, they are built on this whole data classification. And then the last one, I think we touched on it, is it's just getting more complex in IT. There's so many more vectors, including, things that we do every day through our browser, accessing cloud applications, even if they're vetted and approved by the organization, just misusing them outside the purpose that they were intended by the organization puts the business at risk. So Randy, you got any good stories around this that you can share?
Let me start with the process one. I don't think of myself as being a process person, but I understand that process is important and is useful. Within, you mentioned the government, they have a rather well-defined process for classifying data. It starts with U.S. law. It's baked into the law about what constitutes different categories of classification. And then there's an entire process so that, really every document is marked as unclassified, secret, top secret, and so on, and sometimes even down to like the paragraphs. So that may seem excessive to a lot of businesses, but I think the basic premise that you stated, that yes, but you need some way to categorize your data so that what's, like you said, it's all notionally important, but some is really critical and some is not as critical. How do you identify that, and then how do you mark it? You need to be able to communicate that and then you need to be able to communicate that to your people. There are serious ramifications in the government for violating those rules because of the consequences. Again, not advocating that a laundromat have the same security classifications that NSA has, but you still need to have some method for protection. If I switch to the technology, a conversation that we regularly have with the security groups within corporations is they feel a constant tension between security and I'll say business efficiency, because obviously there's some overhead to implementing security. And one of the limitations is speed of deployment, which you mentioned. So do I want to go through a thorough security review, or do I want to get this application out on the web quickly? Well, there's a security risk associated with that. So right now, I'd say really no one has a disciplined methodology for deciding like how quickly, what's the risk benefit payoff here? How much business am I going to lose versus the getting it out quickly? Similarly, a discussion that I had with a giant financial services company is they very much realize that they're at risk of losing money. They're attacked constantly. They manage about $2 trillion worth of funds per year. They've made and they do take security very seriously, but they've consciously made a trade-off that we can make our process more secure, but it would cause us to lose some customers, at least in their opinion. If we make it more and more difficult, let's say for customers to log in and authenticate themselves, they make that too difficult, then maybe customers would go elsewhere. And so they made a considered trade-off that, yeah, okay, we know we're losing some money. In fact, they can quantify it. And to me, it's a lot of money. But they've made the business decision that, yeah, well, we're just going to accept that because we don't want to lose customers. So I think that's fine. That's fine. And in their case, they did have a process and they thought through their decision. I feel that they're rare and that not very many people are doing that.
Well, I think there's a parameter of that conversation that also it's costly to do that high level protection sometimes, and I think that's something that we're looking at and how to solve that cost overhead of security, because it shouldn't be that difficult. So kind of adding to that cost, kind of just talks about the plain fact of difficulties of detection, of detecting threats. If you look at the history of technology, we're only recently started to look at authorized users. Before, when you had a trusted user or a trusted entity, they were trusted, and the carte blanche, they got the full keys to the kingdom, and you were really just worried about the perimeter. I think everybody acknowledged that those days have changed. So, Randy, you want to talk a little bit more about these others and how you see them being difficult in terms of scale and keeping up with them?
Sure. Well, monitoring any network is not trivial, as mathematicians like to say. So just normal network behavior has significant variations, like shocking variations. If you think about yourself, from day to day, you go to different websites as part of your business, or maybe you take a little break and plan travel, or I don't know, look up where you're going to look up the restaurant you're going to eat lunch at. So each day is quite a bit different from another. So from a machine learning or artificial intelligence standpoint, that makes this very challenging because it's difficult to have a training set. It's difficult to define what normal behavior is. And that's for looking for outside attacks. When you're considering authorized users, well, it's even harder because they're part of their behavior is they're supposed to be in your network. They're doing things in your network all the time. So their malicious activity is much subtler and a smaller percentage of what they're doing than an outside attacker would be. Then let me talk about the culture itself. Insider threats are a very sensitive subject for the organization. There's, I don't know, maybe they feel there's some impugned guilt. Should they have screened the employee better? Should they have noticed, something about them that would have triggered this? Should they have had better training? Was there something about their culture that they should have done better? And then most places have a responsibility to report. So once they know that something is wrong, they probably have an obligation to report it to their shareholders, or if they're a regulated enterprise, to the SEC or whatever supervisory committee they might have. Not a good strategy, but a lot of people tend to think that what I don't know won't hurt me. I don't know of any other cases where that's true. What you don't know can hurt you probably more than if you do know it. But anyway, because of those factors, this is a sensitive subject, and people are reluctant to deal with it.
And I think you never know until you go back and look at or experienced it. Let's just put it that. Until you experienced a breach in your organization, and you go, well, how long ago was that? What was the dwell time? And was there any sort of precursor that we just missed? Right? Alert storms happen. People are like, oh, that happens all the time, no problem, right? And who's making that call? So I think the culture also comes down to not maybe they want to find them, but they just don't have the right tool set to get above the noise. Or even if they they have these alerts, they're not understanding if this just is a benign anomaly or something that could be much more serious. So when we talk about this, there's definitely maturity and security today. They've spent a lot of money, time, effort. There's huge, extensive security operations centers that do a fantabulous job. Banks, financials. I mean, they have done this out of necessity. But there's so many other organizations that don't have that high-end regulation. They've only now started to think about this, and they're playing catch up. So, Randy, can you maybe walk through, just do a quick overview of, what people have to select today and where you think the future of, a framework for understanding insider threats might be going forward?
Sure. As the slide says, SIEMs are very popular. They've been in the marketplace for, I don't know, a dozen years or maybe more. They're kind of logical. So the idea is that, well, I have a lot of log files that are created by many different devices on my network. My end user workstation has system log files that Windows creates. My firewalls create log files. The routers create log files. All sorts of things are creating them. So it seems logical that, well, why don't I just pull those all together and use those as my security perimeter? That's logical. It's way better than not doing anything. So definitely a plus. But the downside is, there's a couple of downsides at least. So one is that it's good that you're leveraging what you already have, but most of these log files were not created for security purposes, and they definitely weren't created to work together. So it's easy to have gaps in coverage. So then you have the looking under a spotlight syndrome that this might not be where the problem happened, but it's where I have daylight. It's where I have, it's where I have data for it. So that's where we're going to look. And I'm going to ignore the rest. So that's a problem. Another problem from a data science standpoint is the different log files are really tricky to correlate. So if you think about even the most basic correlation that we'd like to put together things that happen at the same time. So time, that doesn't seem that hard, but actually it is. Because again, these were all created by a variety of different pieces of software, different vendors, they're on different machines. They all have different timestamps. And when you put those together, they don't match. Particularly in the cybersecurity realm where you care about things that happen within milliseconds. So you need to have that kind of accuracy. You really just kind of don't have that. So there are, the there are definitely data scientists who work at at least the big companies and the new startups, the next generation SIMs. They're very ingenious and they're doing their best to overcome these, but it's a barrier to be overcome. And I think there are fundamental limitations that they're really not going to be able to succeed at overcoming. So a thing that we're looking at is, well, let's do purpose-built collection. So instead of trying to do a number of different things, we're really collecting data specifically for the purpose of detecting malicious behavior, insider threats. And as part of that, we've also taken a different approach at looking at something we call positive behavior modeling. So this idea is kind of like detecting counterfeit money. So they at least say that they teach bank tellers to get used to the feel of legitimate money. And then when they have counterfeit money, it sort of shows up because it's different from the normal money. Well, if you took that same sort of approach here, if you could model what normal users are doing, what your legitimate users are doing, then malicious users will stand out from that because at some point they will have to be doing something illicit in order to achieve their objectives that will fall outside of good behavior. That won't be the same. So if you had a good model of normal user behavior, then these anomalies would stand out from that. So that will give us a number of advantages as we go forward.
So Randy, we talked about the positive behavior modeling. I really don't think that we've done a lot of that in cybersecurity because we've been so focused on threat modeling. How does that change the data science aspect of this a little bit? Because you've been focused on both worlds, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of focus on threat modeling, like your diagram shows. Also, I think, like your diagram shows, part of the problem is, wow, there's a lot of threat models. No matter what your taxonomy is, you're going to have a lot of variations on that. So, what kind of actor is it? And then what methodology are they using? There's just a sort of a never-ending number of those. I think it's kind of natural that we have tunnel vision on the threat. That's what we care about. So let's really focus on the threat. And this is kind of the inverting that thinking or flipping that thinking inside out to say, well, no. The problem with threat modeling is, well, you're never going to get to the end of it. There'll be a never-ending set of threat models, and they change all the time. Whereas if you focus more on the positive behavior, that's a lot more stable because what your employees are supposed to be doing is not really changing that quickly and is much more limited than the number of malicious attacks that you can possibly imagine.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're seeing it's making a difference because quite honestly, you can camouflage yourself within an organization. The adversaries can do this. Their techniques and their tactics continually change, but you've got this positive behavior model in place. They really can't replicate the behavioral characteristics endlessly, right? Well, maybe they might be able to do it for one or two steps of their approach, but eventually they're going to have to step out of the box. And at that point in time, they're stepping out of that model, and it'll be clear that something unusual is happening and someone should take action. And I think that's something that's going to help cybersecurity in the long run, make it easier for organizations of all sizes to kind of follow this model, because they don't have to necessarily know what threats are against their organization. They just have to focus on their organization, right? And the threats will suss themselves out because it won't look like normal behavior that their organization is doing.
Yes, exactly.
Hey, I do have a couple questions that have come through. So, one of the questions that came in that talks about the ability to, um, you know, augment logging with additional data sources through their SIM, and then use, the behavior analytics. And they're kind of asking, like, well, won't that be good enough for their needs to move them forward? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an obvious thing to do. It makes sense. We talked about that there are gaps in coverage with the logs, and so it seems logical that, well, I'll just add some more log files in, and that will cover it. Um, and then data science can do magic. At least that's what I've been told. And so that should take care of any problems. The trouble is that you still have this same fundamental problems that we discussed. Okay, so you added more log files. You had, I don't know, 50, and now you have 51 log files. They still weren't made to operate against this threat. You still have the problems with correlating them. So I don't know. Like I said, it's a logical thing to do, but I'm a little doubtful that it makes your problem that much better because of the fundamental limitations. And of course, I think you should use data science for everything. So, that's good. But even data science, it is not actual magic. So you can't overcome fundamental. If the data is not there, it's not there. And you're just going to be making it up if you try to generate results based on just flat out missing data.
That's a great point. The next question I have is a little less about technology, but kind of more about the culture question. This person, I get the sense that they're trying to persuade their organization to look into the value of behavior analytics to help understand insider threat detection. But they have a CIO who's been focused on just their perimeter and traditional security technologies. And unfortunately, this kind of detection, it might be, he's still in the older definition that, it's just insider people who are acting maliciously, and maybe he doesn't understand the growing definition of insider threats. But do you have any quick tips to help that person kind of present the value of this to their CIO to help them persuade them to look into this a little bit more?
Well, maybe a couple of analogies. People in the industry frequently call the perimeter defense the M&M defense, not after the wrapper, but after the candy, where you have a hard outer shell but a soft inside. And the idea is that, the hope, if you do the perimeter defense, is that you can keep people from ever penetrating your perimeter. History says that never works. There's always a way in, whether you're building a fort and people are sneaking in through some hidden tunnel, or you're building, a fort, and you're trying to keep people out with soldiers and concertina wire. There's always a way in. When I worked at NSA, the National Security Agency, we had armed guards with automatic weapons at the perimeter. But once you got in, and guards at the door. But once you got inside, we still had safes, and we still had locks on doors, and we still had additional access protocols, even once you're inside, because the military calls that defense in depth. So the idea is that, well, you're not going to be perfect. And so what do you need to do to protect against, the penetration of your defense? So this is, you put all your eggs in one basket, and now something's in the basket. So you should think about how are you going to secure that?
I think that's a good point. The one other thing I would say about, trying to convince that CIO is, going back to some of the stats about the people, process, and technology. If you don't have a strictly well-defined data classification program, you do have the indicators of what's important to your organization based on who has privileges, based on what applications they're using. And sometimes when you look at behavioral analytics, you have to take into effect all of the connected resources that those people are using. So I think one of the side effects, if you're looking at this in the new framework, is that you'll actually will have better understanding of what is important to your organization. You'll get a little bit more understanding about who's looking at what data and what times to help drive better policies, to help drive the better data classification. So I think maybe from a more traditional person, that would also help with the soft costs to those types of programs that he's also probably worried about. So kind of branch out a little bit for that one.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense.
All right, well, I don't have any more questions, Randy. It was a pleasure talking to you today, and I hope we do this sometime soon.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And just some housekeeping information. If you'd like to maybe request a topic or find out more information, feel free to go to our website, and that's www.changedynamics.io. Thank you, everyone.